welcome to Health Issues. I'm your host, Chris Sylvain, and could not be more excited today about today's program. And in fact, it's a continuation. You know, we do the program on the radio, WBOK, and it's called Wellness Issues. And for the first time, we have the same guest, the guest that was on earlier today. And today we have Dr. Robert St. Martin Westley. He's a professor at Tulane University School of Law, an expert in the area of critical race theory, and you'll hear from him now. Welcome, Dr. Wesley. How are you today?
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, we're excited to have you here and to discuss, you know, as we've been discussing about, and let's carry through. We're dealing with race, we're dealing with the law. But let's even start. I'll have you kind of rehash. You right before the cameras rolled, Dr. Wesley was explaining, giving some context to why we're in a situation we're in. If you can rehash that.
Well, it's my opinion that the problems that we're having today is really a defect in the process of transitional justice that should have occurred at the point that blacks were transitioned from being held as slaves, legally being held as property, and became legally equal citizens. And the defect that I see is that those who were subject to this historical wrong were never invited to the table to have a discussion about what would be just compensation. And instead, what you had was a situation where those who were actually involved in perpetrating the wrong, deciding what would be fair in terms of compensation going forward. And of course, they took a minimalist view. So as I was saying previously, when you look at, for instance, the 13th Amendment, which purports to abolish slavery, the wording of the amendment is such that it actually allows someone to be enslaved if they are convicted of crime, so that if you are a convict, you can be reduced to slavery, and this was the signal for those who weren't finished with slavery, that this is how we do it. This is how we continue to take this population, which was despised and powerless, and continue to exploit.
To use the legal process to where being the criminalization of being a black man, so to speak, being black, and so within our legal structure by upon the 13th Amendment and literally all of the laws before and after, by criminalizing being black, it literally strips away all of the so-called protections of freedom that we could have had.
Yeah, no, the protections are illusory unless the legal standards that are articulated are in fact embraced by the people. So that for those who never really were happy with the abolition of slavery, who were never really happy with black equal citizenship, the laws are written in such a way that that they can still accomplish their racist goals within the wording of the law. And so I think that we really have to have, in effect, a second reconstruction in order to fix some of these problems. But what I imagine is a process that would be akin to what you saw in post-apartheid South Africa, a sort of truth and reconciliation process where those who have been the victims of historical injustice are brought to the table and given an equal voice. It's not about determining outcomes from the beginning. I mean, I don't have a prescription for that. I think that that's something that has to be decided in a collective way, but I think that that what I'm concerned about is, in fact, having a just process.
So the context of everything that's being talked about is we're speaking about the law that's supposed to be blind, that's supposed to be equal. And so from the Constitution and all of the amendments and everything else, what I keep hearing over and over again is that unless the people adjust everything else is meaningless.
No, that's right. That's right. I mean, we have a democracy, we have a republic, but so that the laws are really supposed to be a reflection of the values of the people. But I think that we can point to a number of instances where there's been division within the population about which way to go, which values should be expressed through the law. And so that division on racial issues actually continues. There is not consensus or unanimity on what is fair.
Well, but I think, let me ask this. The issue about the feeling about black people, African Americans, from the majority population, from whites, that we're slower, lazier, less intelligent. Many people feel that they can believe these things and not be racist. But what I'm hearing is, regardless of whether a person believes he's racist or not, once they feel that way about a class of people, which is almost endemic, then the laws, again, aren't strong enough to do anything about when those feelings are there.
Yeah, you can pass laws that purport to outlaw discrimination, but when you do so, it doesn't mean that discrimination disappears, because the laws always have to be enforced, and the enforcement mechanism is not free of human feeling either. So that if you have fallible human beings who are attempting to enforce laws that, for instance, they don't believe in or they don't accept, then you're going to have a problem. You're going to have a problem with making those ideals that are expressed through the law into living realities. And I think that's where we are today on many fronts in terms of racial equality.
Where it's purported to say 60-70% of some communities have all African American males, young males, in prison. Again, like we're speaking about the mass incarceration, the new Jim Crow, could be worse than segregation could have ever been. What's happening in our communities, and so the police officer on the street who is following the law that's been set by the state or by the federal government. Whether the police officer is black or white, but regardless, that police officer, we can go to Baton Rouge all day long to attempt to change laws, but unless we kind of, as you say, do a new reconstruction or whatever,
Right, you have to win hearts and minds. You cannot simply change the words, the wording of the law. You have to also win hearts and minds. And I'm not going to deny that there has been a lot of progress in that area, but there's still a lot more progress that needs to take place. And I think the problem that we're having now is that too many people would like to believe that we're living in a post-racial era, because we have a black president, because civil rights laws have been passed. But now we have a Supreme Court that's saying that we no longer need a Voting Rights Act. We no longer need that kind of enforcement. We have a situation where an entire population of people have been criminalized based on activity that the majority does more than the minority does in terms of the drug enforcement. So it's really it's really sort of a crisis situation, because people are not convinced that there's still a need for remedy.
You made a point earlier, the way the laws are written, even if we look at, again, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, so-called Equal Protection Clause, there's keys in the way the law is written that helps us understand the outcome.
No, that's right. That's right. I mean, but for instance, we haven't spoken yet about how the Supreme Court has played a role in undermining the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is where the Equal Protection Clause is located. It's supposed to prohibit states from treating its citizens unequally. Well, in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson at the end of the 19th century, the Supreme Court said, well, what these words really mean is that the state can segregate on the basis of race. So equal just means separate but equal, right? So they interpreted that provision in a way that created the possibility for Jim Crow. And of course, the Southern states seized on that possibility because they never were happy with the idea of equal black citizenship. And it took until 1954 for the Supreme Court to reverse itself in Brown versus Board of Education and say that separate is inherently unequal. And even then, the court was not able to enforce its own mandate, right? So for another 10, 15 years, schools remained segregated despite Brown versus Board of Education because of massive resistance to that ruling. And there's a way in which, by ignoring race, by saying that we're now colorblind, it's making it possible to reinstitute segregation by other means.
So-called using the philosophy that Martin Luther King espoused to attempt to grab a hold to that utopian ideal.
Yeah, no, it really is a perversion of the views of Dr. King. I think Dr. King would be quite shocked if he were around today to see how his words are being twisted by those who really don't believe in racial justice, but actually want to see the reinstitution of segregation.
Okay. Now, deep within its concept of racial justice, it's always been, it seems it's been the fear of race mixing, which is pretty deep. It's hard to take that fear away if somebody doesn't want a black grandchild. You know, right, and 3/5 black, or one drop rule, or whatever way. I mean, what do we do here?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, again, it's a matter of changing people's hearts, changing people's minds. I think that, you know, that's a very hard process. It's a very slow process. And again, where even where I see some progress on that front, I see a lot of backsliding as well. That people are not as accepting of the idea of interracial couples as the rhetoric of post-color blindness might indicate.
Pretty solid. Let's look at the current laws, though. Like you mentioned so clearly concerning the application of justice. Now, it's got to be other laws other than equal protection that this is going against. I mean, it's the point of it is that the police officer who would arrest the young black male for selling small amounts of marijuana and won't arrest the Caucasian or the white guy, isn't he actually breaking the law?
Well, actually, no, he's not breaking the law, because the way the laws are written, it always allows for discretion on the part of the enforcer. So that discretion is sometimes, in fact, often expressed by where the laws are in fact enforced. So you go into neighborhoods where people might be engaged in street crime or street trade, and make an easy arrest, whereas even more, let's say, the greater amounts of trafficking is taking place behind closed doors in other neighborhoods, not on the street. And so it becomes harder to really go after those particular violators. So I think, you know, because criminal law enforcement in particular always involves discretion, right? And the court has said that that discretion is necessary. There's a very disturbing case that was decided by the Supreme Court a number of years back that involved the death penalty. And there was a study that showed, it was called the Baldus study, and it showed that, that criminal defendants whose victims were white were much, much more likely to receive the death penalty than criminal defendants, regardless of race, whose victims were persons of color. So the Supreme Court looked at that and they said, well, there's essentially nothing we can do about that because we need to allow for discretion on the part of prosecutors to decide when to seek the death penalty.
Clear, unadulterated racism.
Yeah, yeah, yes.
All right. Okay.
So it's not it is in fact a misguided idea that when we see racism in the way the law is enforced, that somehow it's always a violation of the law. It may actually be consistent with the law.
But doesn't that go back to the Constitution and the way it is written?
Well, yeah, and I mean, we talked about a struggle of values. You know, equality is a master value, so to speak. But there's another competing value, which is liberty. And liberty is actually an older and more a value that's more embraced by the system than equality. So there's really a disconnect between the two. There's actually some tension between the value of equality and the value of liberty. And in this country, at least, it seems to me, liberty is given priority over equality.
So, and we talked about that before, the Rand Paul issue of making this, deciding that liberty gives people the right
to discriminate.
Well, if that's what they want to do, and they have more power, they have more guns, and they have more numbers, they can do whatever they want to do.
That's right.
That's right. They have
and of course, the historical question that's not looked into by that view is, well, how did they get more property? How did they get more money? How did they get more guns or whatever it is? And of course, they got it through a process of subordination, theft, of violation of human rights, yes, of what we would today call theft, yes, right? Of treating people in horrible ways, right? But so that's the part that's not looked into by those who want to privilege liberty over equality.
Okay, now, but the United Nations, human rights, of human rights, so where liberty so-called trumps equality, then the world community, it appears through the United Nations, is attempting to equalize human rights and saying that that violates human rights, where the United States is jumping right on board in every other country but our own country.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, the role of the U.S. in the international community on the world stage is actually quite unique, right? In the sense that the standards that we often hold others to, we sometimes don't live up to ourselves. And I think this is a function of claiming a status as the sole superpower. I mean, I think that Mr. Putin is now trying to challenge that to some extent, but for quite some time since the end of the Cold War, the United States, some in the United States, have sort of touted our position as being the sole remaining superpower. And of course, American exceptionalism has been talked about for a very long time throughout most of the 20th century into the 21st. So, you know, we can't necessarily look to the standards that we see being applied in other places and apply them in this country, unfortunately.
Solid. It is what it is. And so in looking at the ideal, and as you said, colonialism, when we look at all of the states, all of the countries that had thrown colonialism off their backs, looking at South Africa and removing apartheid, the models are there for restructuring this. Even I couldn't say our reconstruction because that failed. That was a failure of.
No, that's right.
So, what are some of the models of kind of resetting this, you think?
Well, I mean, I've talked about Truth and Reconciliation, the South African model.
Okay.
There are other models as well. I mean, if we look at what Germany did for the Jewish population after World War II. I mean, at this point, I think that Germany and Israel enjoy relatively cordial relations given what the history has been of German exploitation and attempt at extermination of the Jewish population of Europe. And that's because Germany paid reparations to the Jewish population, and Germany paid reparations to the state of Israel and supports the state of Israel. There's really no equivalent of that for African Americans, and vis-a-vis the United States. Well, vis-a-vis in the U.S. example, what we had was a period of Reconstruction, which you've characterized as a failure. I don't disagree with that. And we had the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment, and a series of civil rights acts, some more successful than others. But as I mentioned earlier, we're now in a period in our history where the civil rights acts of the 60s are being pared back, and it's being claimed that they're no longer necessary, like the Voting Rights Act. Is the Supreme Court is saying that's no longer necessary. There's no racism to justify those provisions any longer.
Yeah, I mean, we see that over and over again. Where the racism in housing, people are like, so what? You know what I mean? That it is.
That's one of the examples I would offer of liberty trumping equality. Right? That, you know, if someone owns a piece of property, a lot of Americans feel that they should be able to do whatever they want with their property, no matter how it affects others.
Right, and the same thing, people, you hear it over and over again, blacks commit more crimes, and so regardless, like, who cares that they're arrested more? Who cares that we have the highest incarceration rate in the world? That But from looking at a Truth and Reconciliation Committee or bringing that to the table as equals, like you said, regardless of what outcomes are, that is just fair, just, and right.
Right. Well, I think having the conversation can be redemptive if the conversation happens in a way that really respects the full participation and equality of every participant. And that's something that we in fact have not had. You know, right now there's a process that's been initiated by a number of Caribbean countries to seek reparations from the former European slave powers, from Spain and Portugal and France and Britain. And one thing that's come out in that process is that David Cameron and his wife are both descendants of slave owners who received reparations for the loss of their slaves.
Wow.
So you have someone who is directly implicated in a historical injustice, who benefited from that historical injustice, who's now going to decide whether there should be compensation paid to those who didn't benefit.
Yeah, it's almost as this, as when we look at this, and the average 21-year-old on the street, and when he watches a police car saying to protect and to serve, he knows it's to protect and to serve somebody else and not him. They don't see that there, that it's when they say there's no justice. So these terms, when we speak about justice and I guess we'll just leave it right at justice.
Well, the reason why I think that a process properly constructed could actually be redemptive in ways that might be, in fact, regardless of material outcomes, let's say, is because it would provide an education for everyone. You know, I mean, a lot of people have come to this country as immigrants subsequent to Jim Crow or subsequent to other historical injustices that the United States was a part of, and who don't know this history. There are a lot of people who could trace their ancestors back to the beginning who nevertheless were never educated about this history. And there are a lot of people, of course, who remain victims of this history who don't know enough of the details of how things got the way they are. And so I think educating people is the beginning of reconciliation. It's the beginning of redemption of a really tragic part of our national life.
That continues over and over again until we can come to the table. And at one point, justice has to be established. How can a civilized society operate without justice? And we're seeing that today.
Well, you know, I can definitely understand the view of those who want to simply focus on the future. But this is really about focusing on the future, right? Because my view is that in order to have a future in which we really are committed to equality and justice and fairness for all, is by first trying to unravel how did we get to this point where those things that we say we believe in are not actually enforced or happening for everyone.
Awesome, Dr. Westley. I wish we had more time. We'll be able to come back at this again, over and over again. These concepts, they have to come from a legal standpoint. They have to come from a studied way. And so we thank you for all that are watching. I think we've heard food that we can chew on, things we can work on. So let's fight as hard as you can in everything you do. Fight for justice, fight for truth, fight for righteousness. Thank you so much.